In this episode, I'm going to talk with Holly Testa, the Director of Shareholder Engagement for First Affirmative Financial Network. This is the Impact Financial Planners podcast with Bill Holliday, brought to you by AIO Financial, a fee-only financial planning firm specializing in socially responsible investing at AIOfinancial.com. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I'm excited to have an interview with Holly Testa of First Affirmative. She actually lives on a boat which is docked in a harbor on Oahu, or in Oahu, Hawaii. So if you watch the video of our interview, you'll actually see her move side to side during it. It's kind of funny. So Holly Testa, as I said, is the Director of Shareholder Engagement for First Affirmative. First Affirmative is an SEC-registered investment advisor. She's been affiliated with First Affirmative for over 20 years in several capacities. Holly works with several coalitions of institutional investors who engage with companies on environmental, social, and corporate governance issues to positively influence the performance and impact of the companies owned in First Affirmative clients' accounts. She participates in dialogue with companies, files shareholder resolutions, joins multi-stakeholder campaigns to influence related public policies, and directs the firm's proxy voting activities. All right, let's go to our interview. All right, Holly, thanks for joining me. Could you briefly tell us about First Affirmative and what they provide?
Well, thanks for having me, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your podcast here today. First Affirmative is part of the Folio Financial family of companies, and that offers online investing technology and also services to advisors and investors, broker-dealers. And First Affirmative offers asset management and consulting services, but to both individuals and to institutions. And we have over 1 billion in assets under management administration. I'm dreaming big there. Our clients come to us because they're really seeking to align their investment decision-making with their personal value or mission, and at the same time, meeting their financial goals. And so that's what we help them do. And we do that through a network of investment advisors like yourself that help clients assess and define their long-term goals, both financially and from a value standpoint. And from there, we develop diversified portfolios that are designed to meet those goals. Part of our investment process, it includes environmental, social, and governance screening, which is a big mouthful, so we say ESG. And we also take into consideration the issues that are really the most important to the client. So our process is very client-focused. And finally, we're a certified B Corp. And what that means is that we're a for-profit business. But unlike the traditional C corporation, we're actually legally required to consider the impact of our decisions on our customers, the environment, the community, our employees. And we're actually pretty proud we won a B Corp award for one of the best in the world companies this year.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know that. That's good. Yeah, and you have put on a conference every year, which is really nice.
Yes, I was going to mention that. It's in our hometown of Colorado Springs this year at the Broadmoor.
Yeah,
so
I'm looking forward to that at the, I guess, November 1st.
Yes.
That starts. And then why do you engage in shareholder advocacy?
Our investment strategy using the ESG analysis helps us to manage portfolio risks, and it allows our clients to support and profit from better managed companies. But that doesn't mean that those companies are perfect. In fact, sometimes far from that. Oftentimes, companies will sell in one area of ESG, but lag way behind in others. And so as a shareholder, I think we can impact that corporate behavior by exercising our rights as investors. So really, from our viewpoint, advocacy is really about communicating investor expectations on behalf of our clients and then pressing our companies to meet those expectations.
Yeah, and I think that advocacy part is really how you make an impact. The screening is nice that you're supporting certain companies, but this is a big piece, the advocacy. So what is your shareholder advocacy process?
Well, there's numerous methods of engaging with companies, and some of those are formal, and they're dictated by rules and regulations that are established through legislation and through the Securities and Exchange Commission, which the SEC, which regulates investment advisors. And then others are more informal. And I'd argue that some of the informal ones are actually probably more impactful. But I'll start with proxy voting because I think most people know about proxy voting. Anybody who's an investor in a company often gets those big, nasty mailings with lots of information and requests to vote. So public companies are required to hold annual meetings, and this is where shareholders have an opportunity to vote on issues that are raised by both management and by shareholders. So investors don't generally attend these meetings, although it can be very interesting, but they can vote by proxy. Some common items on the ballot would include voting for board of director elections, approving executive compensation packages, or not, as the case may be. And then qualifying shareholders can also present resolutions that are voted on as well. I'll talk more about that later because that's a big part of what we do. Most of our clients delegate that proxy voting authority to us, and they do that because we can vote easily and electronically on behalf of clients. And we do that according to proxy voting guidelines that comprehensively address ESG issues. So hopefully we're addressing those issues that they want to, and voting quite a bit differently probably than the standard investment management firm on some of these issues.
Yeah, no, and I think it's good to pass that off because some of the wording of, I guess, proxy initiatives or a lot of times voting it's not clear exactly what you're doing as a layman. So it's nice having someone look at those carefully.
Yeah, well, it's hard enough, I think, sometimes for professionals to figure out exactly what a proxy might be saying, to be honest. So
and the implications of it.
Yes.
So what's your process for developing resolutions?
When it comes to resolutions, I think that most of them are developed in partnership with organized and informal coalitions of institutional investors that have similar goals and concerns. Extensive research needs to be done on an issue in general, and then also how it might impact a specific industry or company. And the goal of resolutions is not just to move a single company to act, but to actually promote systemic change. Action on climate probably being the prime example. So by getting a few companies to lead on an issue, their peers will often follow.
Sure.
And that's really what we're looking for, systemic change. And I'll give you an example. Since 2009, 85 companies have agreed to sustainability reporting as a result of shareholder resolutions. Well, that sounds big and we're very proud of that. But even more importantly, over 80% of the S&P 500 companies published sustainability reports in 2015. Compare that to just under 20% in 2011. So if you move enough companies, it becomes standard practice.
Right. They don't want to be left behind and thought of as the...
Peer pressure works at any age.
Yeah.
So, and so a lot of this happens not so much through resolutions. I do want to stress that resolutions are part of a process, but really what's more important is the dialogue that we have with companies. Because the ideal outcome of a resolution is to withdraw it after you've talked with the company.
Sure.
And oftentimes those kinds of discussions will lead to ongoing discussions with that company on a broad array of issues. And that's really the ideal situation because in some cases you become a partner with that company. One of the things that I think is really important about shareholder engagement is that we really advocate for long-term performance, and that involves doing well on environmental, social, and governance issues. And I think we can serve as a counterbalance because there's an awful lot of investors out there that are very engaged in short-term. They want short-term quarterly performance.
Right.
And we can serve as a counterbalance to the company saying, hey, we're an investor too, and we want you to focus on long-term issues. And I think that gives them a little bit more leeway to maybe sacrifice some short-term gain in order to do better over the long term.
Gotcha. Yeah. And so when you have an issue like climate change, you're identifying companies that you want to target and then reaching out to them. So the shareholder resolutions aren't tool number one.
Not usually. Now, there are some companies that have a history of not responding to investors. And if that's the case, they might get a resolution more upfront. But generally speaking, we would rather open the door first, and oftentimes we'll do that through a letter. And I'll give you an example of that. A successful campaign that we had last year is we took a look at all of the companies and who we had voted against on the nominating committee of boards because the company lacked diversity. And we have a pretty high bar for that, but we noticed when we were looking at our portfolio companies that quite a number of our smaller companies had no women on their board. And oftentimes there was no racial diversity either. So we sent 10 companies. Fortunately, most of our companies have taken action on diversity and they are improving. But these laggards, extreme laggards, I'll call them, we sent them a letter expressing our concern and asking some pretty pointed questions about their process. Well, in the letter writing campaign, we got quite a number of responses back, which led to really helpful dialogues with those companies. And as a result, we have over half of those companies have either had improved their standards and practices on their selection process, and many of them have put their first woman on the board.
That's great.
So to us, that's a real concrete answer, but the work's not done yet. There's some companies we wrote letters to, no response. And so we'll be filing a resolution with one of those companies. Actually, we already have this year, kind of elevating the heat of that issue so that if they don't respond this time, it's going to go to a vote at the annual meeting.
Great. Oh, that's great. That's, it almost seems overwhelming, the number of companies out there and the number of issues to address. Is there a group that you're kind of picking, hey, this year, let's focus on this? Or, there's a lot of balls in the air there.
Yeah, we're actually going through that process right now because there's a proxy season. Filing resolutions tends to happen in the fall. And so we're gearing up for figuring out where do we escalate. And that can be very difficult. Some longstanding issues, the reality is they're always on the agenda. So climate, human rights, diversity. And oftentimes what we'll do is we will focus on a subset of issues within that broader issue. But these issues are commonalities that our advisors find as far as a value is amongst most of our clients. So we try to focus on issues that really resonate with our client base in general. We also carefully consider the business case for corporate action because that's important too. As an investor, we need to make a strong business case. And in many cases, we can on these issues. So right now, we're considering what we're going to do. We of course have to make choices. This year, we're going to be focusing on following up on our diversity campaign. And then also, we're focusing a lot on financing climate change, so talking with banks about how they can support green energy and renewables while at the same time de-emphasizing fossil fuels.
Great.
So we're going to be talking to them a lot about renewable energy efficiency, and how they can look for that in their banking lending portfolios. And then we also want to focus on renewable energy and energy efficiency with big energy users. Another thing we're doing this year is focusing on what I'll call extreme laggards. Last year we did it with diversity, and this year I think we're going to do it with sustainability reporting, because it's getting to the point where if you don't have a sustainability report of some sort, you're really behind the game.
You're an outlier. That makes sense. And when you come up with these campaigns, do you try to get more pressure than just dialogue with the company? Is there a campaign to communicate with other big shareholders?
Yes, actually there is. And I'll give you an example. When we file a resolution as a lead filer, so you can lead file or co-file resolutions. And on lead files, you have more responsibility because you're basically in charge of the dialogue and you're the one that has the authority to make the decision whether to withdraw, to go to the vote. So when you're the lead filer, it's always helpful to have a strong level of support from other shareholders. So education over time is really important. And so what we do is if we lead file a resolution that's going to go to a vote, we write a detailed supporting memo, and that can be used to make our case with other investors. And so we make sure that those are received by proxy voting firms and selected money managers in an effort to build the case. Another thing I want to mention is that oftentimes, especially with new issues, there's an education process that goes on. So oftentimes there's an issue that comes up that might be really important, but it's not recognized yet as a material issue to many investors. And so sometimes you have to file a resolution 2 or 3 times.
Mm.
And as the investors get to see it, especially the major institutional investors, it takes time basically to convince them that, yes, this is an important issue the company should address, and it increases the vote over time. And I also want to stress that getting a majority vote is not necessary for a resolution to, I won't say win. There's this mythology here about you win if you get over 50%. The reality is we often win if we get over 30%, for example, because that's enough to bring the company to the table, because that's a significant number of investors that is concerned
Yeah,
about
that's
a
a good
particular
point.
issue.
And
So really,
especially,
resolutions, letters, all of these things are really designed to get to the company to the table.
yeah. And what percent of voters are actually voting on these? I mean, because when you say 30%,
Yeah.
that's a lot, even if 100% are voting, but I imagine it's even a smaller percentage that bother.
Yeah, it is. The place where there's a real lack of voting is amongst retail investors. And as of course you could imagine, if you're an investor that holds 15 or 20 companies and you're getting all of this information, it can be difficult to vote.
Sure.
Institutional investors generally vote. Unfortunately, a lot of institutional investors, up until fairly recently, have voted in lockstep with management.
Right.
So whatever management recommends, they would vote that way. That is changing. There's been some big changes in that area. There's some major institutional money managers like BlackRock, like State Street, several others. And they are starting to talk a lot more vocally about ESG issues and talking about how they're using that screening process, and they're having higher expectations of their companies, and they are starting to selectively vote in favor of shareholder proposals. And I
That's
think that really catches a company's attention. So there is an evolution going on. It's slow, but it is definitely changing, and I think the vote counts will go up.
That's exciting. What could you just run over what the process is to even be able to file or to be able to
Yes.
engage?
Engaging, sometimes it can be as simple as just writing to the company. Filing a resolution, there is a process that you have to go through that's very formal. In order to file it all, you have to be what's called a qualifying shareholder. And what that means is that you have to own at least $2,000 worth of shares for at least 1 year. And you have to hold those shares through the resolution. And what that means is that you have to hold those shares until the resolution's withdrawn, or it goes to a vote at the annual meeting. And then there's also rules to follow as far as there's deadlines to meet, there's length requirements. The resolution has to address an issue that is not considered to be ordinary business or something that would be interfering with the day-to-day running of the company. And companies actually have and they do so fairly regularly. I think it's about 20% of resolutions are challenged at the SEC. And they can do so by citing certain issues. Ordinary business is one. Personal grievance, if they can prove that it's a personal grievance that's driving the resolution. Also, it has to be something that is material, that materially impacts the company. And if they can convince the SEC it falls into one of these categories, they can omit it from the ballot. So the SEC decides that.
Otherwise, it has to go on the ballot?
Otherwise, it has to go on the ballot. And if that's the case, oftentimes even companies that might not want to will come and discuss it with shareholders and try to get it withdrawn because they prefer not to see it on the ballot.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And is there any advantage of having a lot of backing instead of just having $2,000? Team up with other people so you kind of have more pressure that this is an issue?
Yeah, we tend to do that, but it can be very effective just one person filing. There's some individual filers out there that file on a lot of governance issues, for example, and they regularly get very high votes because what they're asking for makes sense. So if you have a good argument, you can stand up there with $2,000 worth of shares and make your case. But it's also true that having many more filers can also have an impact. And that's why we often co-file with partners.
Yeah.
So even though we're not lead filing, we're co-filing, so we're supporting them. So you might have some resolutions that are filed with 10 or 20 investors. And for some companies, that can catch their attention, especially if there are larger pension plans and investment managers that are filing these resolutions. It can help.
And so your co-filers, the ones you're working with, they're changing depending on what company you're going or what issue you're addressing? Or is it generally the same group of
Yes, absolutely.
That it changes?
It can change, but we do have some regular partners. For example, First Affirmative retains the services of other money managers who have strong advocacy programs, and we will partner with them because we use their services in our client portfolio. So in a way, we have multiple people, investment managers, advocating on our clients' behalf. So we often partner with Boston Common, Trillium Asset Management, Domini, Calvert, Zevin Asset Management, to name a few. Since these investment managers often specialize in certain areas, we will partner with them on certain campaigns. Some examples of that is Green Century, a mutual fund that does primarily environmental advocacy. We partner with them on deforestation issues. Boston Common Asset Management has a climate campaign with the banks. And so for some companies in that campaign, we will lead, and for others, we are support. So we'll attend dialogues and support them. So that's really important, I think, is we do support each other. There are also quite a number of coalitions that we work with that are formal coalitions, like Ceres helps with our climate campaigns. Investors Environmental Health Network is a specialist in toxins and chemicals. And so they help investors organize around those issues. There's also a lobbying campaign that we work with. And they help us with research and with targets, selecting targets that make sense to people who are laggards or corporations that are laggards. They help us target who might be the best people to contact.
When you say lobbying, does that mean in the political arena?
In the political arena, we file resolutions. Many companies do not disclose their lobbying, especially when they're doing it through third parties like trade associations.
Okay.
And so there's a lot of money that gets funneled through corporations. They get spent on lobbying, and you don't know where that money's coming from. And
Gotcha.
So we think it's very important that companies disclose not only how they're choosing to lobby or spend any money on political spending on election campaigns as well, but who they're supporting, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, what's the business case. And we think that's very important. So that's another issue we work on.
That's super. Yeah, you're touching on a lot of issues. I guess, what are your thoughts about, it sounds like shareholder advocacy is actually getting some momentum and changing in a good way. I have heard of legislation and other issues that don't sound as promising. What's the latest, I guess, with the legislative side?
Yes, the latest is always changing these days. And yes, it is bad news that there are quite a few pressures out there on our work right now, trying to constrict our rights as shareholders to have contact with companies. I like to look at the good side and think that that means that we're making a difference and we're having a change because we are gaining traction. Nevertheless, it's taking a lot of bandwidth to actually try to fight back some of these issues. So what you're referring to, I think, probably first and foremost, is some legislation that actually passed the House. It's called the Financial Choice Act. And this act and a lot of other efforts underway are heavily supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. And it's kind of interesting because many of the corporate members of these trade groups actually have really good climate programs, and yet their trade association may be using their money to lobby against those very friction point that we have with companies, is that if you're doing this on one side, you can't under the table put money someplace else. But at any rate, the legislation that has passed the House, but hopefully won't pass the Senate, I'll just give you a couple examples because a lot of it's arcane, but this one's probably the most powerful. They want to restrict who can file a shareholder resolution. I had told you about how you need $2,000 in shares for 1 year. And that sounds pretty minimal, but, there's still resolutions. It's been constant, the number of resolutions for the past, probably 4 or 5 years. So resolutions haven't grown. I don't think that they're a big hassle for the companies to deal with in spite of what they might say. But the Financial Choice Act would change that holding requirement to having to hold a 1% stake in a company for 3 years.
Wow.
Now, 1%, you think, oh, that doesn't sound very much, but let's put some context on that. Only 8 shareholders would have qualified in 2017 to file at Apple.
Yeah.
7. That is a huge restriction. Only the very largest institutional investors would be able to file a resolution. And the reality is they don't file resolutions because they already have an open door to these companies. That's one of the things that we're fighting amongst various other legislative action. And then also at the SEC, there's a lot of pressure on the SEC right now to use the no action process, for example, to make it harder or make it easier for companies to omit resolutions from the ballot. So that's another front that we're working on. But again, despite these challenges, interest in ESG principles is skyrocketing.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of recent activity at a lot of the largest institutional money managers that indicates that this is not going to go away. So we will keep fighting. We actually are a founding member of the Shareholder Rights Group, which is an organization of smaller institutional investors and also some individual investors that are organized to put out facts about the shareholder process to counter some of the hyperbole that's going on the other side. So,
sure.
so
Great.
yes, some challenges, but also a lot of encouraging signs as well.
Well, if listeners want to get more information about this, contact you or get information about First Affirmative, what's the best way to connect?
Well, probably the best place to start for me is just to pop me an email, Holly Testa at firstaffirmative.com.
Great.
And you can look at me on Twitter, and that's @HTesta and the numeral 2. And then if you want to get any information on First Affirmative and our investment management services, you can go to www.firstaffirmative.com. And it also has an advocacy page with current information about our shareholder initiatives. And also a lot of, there's a document there called Advocacy in Action, and you can get more detail about the process in general. And that's a very helpful document for advisors and for clients to take a look at that. We also have a Twitter handle at first-affirm, and you can also find us on Facebook.
Perfect. I will put links to all those on the show notes in the blog.
Well, the other one you might want to put on there, you mentioned the SRI conference. We have a conference website that has the agenda and all of the details, and that's at www.sriconference.com.
Perfect. I will put a link there as well. That's great. Thank you very much, Holly, for your time. This has really been informative.
Well, thank you very much. It's been fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right. I hope you found that to be helpful. That shareholder advocacy is really a great tool for making an impact. Thank you for listening to the Impact Financial Planners podcast. This has been brought to you by AIO Financial. If you need help with any part of your finances, please contact AIO Financial for a free meeting, aiofinancial.com. They're fiduciary, comprehensive, fee-only advisors. As always, I appreciate any feedback you have, good, bad, suggestions, recommendations, questions. You can contact me through Twitter, Facebook, email, bill@aiofinancial.com. And if you like these podcasts, please give a brief review or rating, or there's videos. Please subscribe to our channel. All right, thanks a lot. Take care.